value capture is a case where your values are rich and subtle or in the process of developing that way. And you get put in a setting or near a technology or an institution that presents you with a simplified, typically quantified version, and the simplified version takes over, like going onto social media to connect to people and then becoming obsessed with likes or follows, or becoming a journalist to give important news and then becoming obsessed individually or as an institution with page views and clicks, or going to school out of a love of education and becoming obsessed with GPA. Or, I mean, the list is endless. And I think what I became aware of was that it wasn't, at first you might think it's just an accident, like these are just bad measures. But what I started feeling was that there was some sense in which systematically large-scale institutional metrics missed what was important.
Hello and welcome to Why Is This Happening with me, your host, Chris Hayes. Before we get started today, a brief point of personal privilege, which is that I wrote a book a year ago. It's called The Siren's Call, How Attention Became the World's Most Endangered Resource. I think I tried to write a book of sort of pop philosophy in my own way. I don't think my publisher wants me to describe it that way, but you'll see why I'm describing it that way when we get later into today's conversation. But that book came out last year. I know a bunch of you read it, and I got amazing some feedback from a lot of you. But the paperback is coming out today, the day that you're listening this in your ear holes. You can get it now in paperback. If you haven't read it, I also read the audiobook. And I think increasingly as we live through the madness that we live through, that attention keeps coming back around as a sort of central resource of our age, the sort of feeling of alienation and abstraction we have all the time. And this book is an attempt to wrestle with that. I'm also doing an event on February 5th in New York at Cooper Union. Jonathan Haidt, who wrote The Anxious Generation, the enormous bestseller, will be there too. You could check that out online if you Google it. Would love to see you there. Love doing live events. And the other reason this is fitting is because we have another amazing philosophy discussion ahead of us today, philosophy in the best kind of way. Before I tell you what it's about, I briefly tell you my weekend was watching a lot of football, particularly watching the Chicago Bears. I'm a Bears fan. I grew up in the Bronx, but a Chicago sports fan because my dad's from Chicago. I have inculcated that in my children. My two older kids and I got very into the Bears this year because they were good. We watched the Bears game. If you don't pay attention to the football, they have had this magical season in which they've come from behind improbably time and time again. And they almost did it again, including a last-second pass that was utterly improbable and sent everyone through the roof going insane. It ended in a gut punch fashion when the Bears actually lost the game in overtime. And we were the highs and the lows. I mean, just screaming with excitement and then just got completely devastated to the point of like near tears in the case of my kids. And you have this moment, you step back, you're like, why have I chosen? Why have I produced a set of choices in which I have chosen to get my heart broken over a thing that I know and my 11-year-old and my 14-year-old know, and we all know does not matter in the world. It just doesn't matter. You could choose to not care, but you have invested in caring, and it is only through the volitional act of investing and caring that you can get the joy on the one hand, and then you also have to get the heartbreak. But there's something very strange about the relationship that we have to sports in this instance, which is a smaller category of the overall category of games. A weird paradoxical relationship we have to that kind of investment. And at some level, I think when we think of games, we think of kids. But when you zoom out and you think about the size of sports in the world, it is very much not just a thing about kids. When you think about the size of the video gaming industry and the gaming industry, it is very much not about kids. And then when you think about the fact that almost every aspect of our life, from the likes on social media to the professional metrics we receive, have been in some ways gamified, have been assigned some score, and we move through the world constantly encountering some kind of scorekeeping about the things we do for fun and the things we do for work. Games are basically everywhere you look, and games are the subject of a magnificent, phenomenal new book by a philosophy professor at the University of Utah. His name is C.T. Wynn. The book is called The Score: How to Stop Playing Somebody Else's Game. It's a work of philosophy about games. I've been recommending it to just about everyone I know in the day that I've been reading this book, because it's one of those books that just feels so novel and so fresh, and you want to share it with people. So, Professor Wynn, welcome to the program.
Thank you. You have just like cheered me up immeasurably. And now I'm just like, now you can like break my heart. So we can go through the whole cycle here together.
Yes, you're invested. Will you just tell me a little bit both about just your background coming into this? You're a philosopher at the University of Utah. I want you to just tell me a little bit about how you found your way to philosophy and your sort of relationship to it, because I think that actually starts to get into some of the aspects of how you came to this book.
Yeah, I mean, I think I came to philosophy just naturally, like the kinds of questions philosophy asks, like the big ass, weird, like shift your, I mean, I'm a perspective shift junkie, and I think philosophy just like smacks you with that over and over again. That's a pretty normal story. The weird story is how I started down the very bizarre route of the field of the philosophy of games, because that's not really a legitimate topic for a lot of philosophy. It's not the kind of thing that you're like I still think I bring shame upon my mentors and teachers from graduate school because I went down this path. But I got obsessed for two reasons. One reason was I was teaching philosophy of art, and I'd always had this experience where I was like, I wish I'd been a music critic in the birth of jazz. And at the same time, without thinking about it, I'd been on this website called Board Game Geek, like reviewing and trying to understand these new and exciting board games. And I started doing these case studies in my philosophy of art class about whether games are art. And I read a bunch of stuff, and it pissed me off. It all like made me furious because all of it treated games like a kind of movie, and it praised the parts of games that are most movie-like, the cinematics, the cutscene, the stuff that we already know what it's like. And it almost never talked about, the stuff I was reading never talked about the fact that we made choices, the fact that we had to do skilled activities. And so I went down this path of being like, I want to, the weirdest, dumbest thing that I can do with my life, which I've decided to do, is to give a theory of why games are good, why games are an art form that centers that. And then I ran across this moment from Rainer Knizia, this German. He is often called the Mozart of European board games, and he is. He's made like 500 genius, brilliant, gorgeous board games. And he said, the most important, this is a talk he gave at the Game Developers Conference. He said, the most important tool in my game design toolbox is the scoring system, because the scoring system sets the player's motivations in the game. It tells you what to care about. And this hit me in two ways. As a game player, I was like, that's a very clear way of saying something I've always known, right? You open a game and it tells you what you're going for. It even tells you who your friends are and who you hate. And it tells you whether you're all that. And you can literally, there's this core weirdness that's so familiar that you forget about it until you see it from the right angle, which is that my wife and I can decide to play a game, and we open up the game. And if it's a new game, the game will literally tell us whether we're trying to kill each other or cooperate. And then we look at the rules and we're like, yeah, okay. And then we just do it. And then we suddenly plunge into this alternate self, which could be totally cooperative or could be totally competitive. And there's another part of me, the philosopher part of me, that was like, oh my God, scoring systems just set our desires. And we human beings are the kind of person that can literally open up a book, find out what tells us what the scoring system is, and just go all in and care profoundly. And I mean, what I've come to become obsessed with is the two faces of that experience. Mm-hmm. One face of which is how amazingly beautiful, weird, interesting indie board game has become, and tabletop role-playing games and video games, and this flowering of like gorgeous, weird, interesting interaction created by scoring systems. And the other half of my life has become increasingly worried about the proliferation of large-scale institutional scoring systems that crush like everything that is beautiful and everything I care about. This book was like me talking myself out of the weird ass puzzle that I generated for myself, which I genuinely had no idea if anyone else would ever be interested in, which is why is it this thing, clear scoring systems, are so joyous and rich and playful in some contexts and so draining and deadening in other contexts.
I have to say, just speaking for myself, how much I related to so many parts of this book, and that was one of them. And I wonder if you would speak about your own personal experience outside of the game world. So you need to create a scoring system to sort of set intentions, incentives, and goals. Right. That's the kind of magical condition necessary to get the sort of the goal-directed movement and investment that could produce the flowering of a great game and all the things that come with that, which you could talk about. Outside of games, we face all sorts of scoring systems that seem to do the opposite. They drain the joy out of things that should be joyful. They drain the wonder out of things that should be wonderful. Talk about your own experience, because I found this very relatable. I'll talk about my own, actually, because I have a very clear one as well.
Yeah, so I mean, this just... I want to say, like, a lot of this book is not like me tisking from on high. A lot of this book is me talking about how I've screwed myself over in my life over and over and over again. It's about, I mean, I think a lot of these stories are familiar. Like, I started exercising and I was like, cool. And I started exercising and I started feeling better about myself. And then I got obsessed with losing weight. Right. And then I started obsessively entering my macros and my nutrients and my calories to make, and there's a first moment where improving my diet a little bit made me feel better. And then there is a year of just moving into misery, forgetting to not eating anything delicious and just hollowing myself out. I mean, this happened to me in philosophy. This is the weird thing. You might have thought that if anybody is not vulnerable to this, it would be the philosophers. Exactly. We are vulnerable as hell, right? Yes. So I went into philosophy because I loved weird, interesting questions about the meaning of life and why any of this is here and why are things beautiful. And then I went into philosophy grad school and I got enculturated. And in philosophy, there is a status ranking collated by survey of what the status is of the journals you publish in and the departments you can be at. And you don't know any of this when you go to grad school. You're like, philosophy is cool. I want to think about the meaning of life. And then almost everyone comes out being like, what is my highest ranked publication? What is the ranking of my job? And there's a shift. And this is the shift that I started thinking about, because when that happened, what my sense of what I was trying to do changed. Because as it turns out, for various complex institutional reasons, a lot of the stuff that gets you published in high-status journals is not big, meaningful questions. It's fairly technical work on fairly arcane issues, and it's kind of micro moves. I mean, I would say some of these micro moves are very valuable, but it's tiny technical logic pushing.
Over specialization at the margins of some question that people are developing.
Right. And I got obsessed with this. I got obsessed with moving up the ranking, and I started writing philosophy that bored me. And then I wanted to die. And then and then at some point I was in some place where I was like, I've made the weirdest decision of my life, which is to abandon any possible financial reward by not being a lawyer, by leaving Silicon Valley, by being in this weird ass dumb profession, which the only possible reason you could do it is out of love. And yet somehow I have found myself writing boring philosophy I hate in order to move up this internal ranking system. And then I was like, and I think there's this raw reaction I often have, which is kind of like, what's going on? What are we doing here? And at the same time, I had this same experience of I was the learning outcomes liaison at my first job. And if you don't know what this is, I'm a philosophy professor. We have a philosophy department. We tell people we're educating our students. And the outside world, right, the state legislature is prove to us you're not full of crap. And so we need to have quantified metrics that show that we're doing well. And the thing is, most of the learning outcomes that are available that are institutionally collected are not about the things that we care about, right? They're not about curiosity. They're not about virtue. They're not about growth. They're not about ethical development. They're about graduation rates, graduation speed, how quickly people get a job. They're about things that are definitely important, but they are not the heart of what I think education is. And so I became obsessed with, I needed a name for this. So the name I eventually ended up giving it was value capture. So value capture is a case where your values are rich and subtle or in the process of developing that way. And you get put in a setting or near a technology or an institution that presents you with a simplified, typically quantified version, and the simplified version takes over, like going onto social media to connect to people and then becoming obsessed with likes or follows, or becoming a journalist to give important news and then becoming obsessed individually or as an institution with page views and clicks, or going to school out of a love of education and becoming obsessed with GPA, or the list is endless. And I think what I became aware of was that it wasn't, at first you might think it's just an accident, like these are just bad measures. But what I started feeling was that there was some sense in which systematically large-scale institutional metrics missed what was important, that there was something in the nature of metrics that was systematically opposed to human value. And this is what I've been trying to figure out.
Yeah, my own, you just mentioned a version of my own. I mean, I got into journalism because when I was in an undergraduate, I think I wanted to, at first I wanted to go to philosophy grad school. And then I had this sort of dawning awareness about, well, the thing I really like to do, I like to read and I like to write and make stuff. And what if I could, as opposed to paying for grad school or paying for someone to do it, what if I could do that for a living? And I know you were a journalist earlier in your career too. And so I went to journalism, and the reason that I love what I do and have loved what I do is I love to learn stuff and I love to make something out of that learning. I like to learn stuff, synthesize it, and then create something out in the world. That's like what I love to do. And when I got the 8 p.m. show, I was just inundated with this ratings pressure where we would look at the ratings every day. We would get a spreadsheet that would come to us at 4:15, and it would show all the ratings for all the cable networks in 15-minute increments, all the hours. And this just came to totally dominate my life, my inner life, my experience of the job. I mean, for years, to the point where I was like the most miserable I've ever been in my life, and certainly my professional life, and had strangled every last ounce of wonder, joy, curiosity, enjoyment. And I think honestly, a lot of the things that I'm good at out of it. And I made this definitive break 6 years ago where I stopped looking at it, which has basically been the hinge point transformation for everything that's happened since then.
Your story is like exactly like my story, right? And I just want to point out one thing. There's two things we should separate. One is incentives and the other is value capture. So the world can definitely incentivize you with metrics. Like people know about this thing called Goodhart's law, right? When a measure becomes incentive, it stops being a good measure. And it's already clear that when you incentivize based on a metric, and if that metric is thin, you're pushing people to miss a lot of what's really important. But I think something else happens that you described perfectly. There's a transition from incentives to core values, right? One thing is to know that it's useful for you to have an audience, and you'll make enough money to survive if your subscriber count goes up. The other is for that to become the focal point of your attention and your cares. And the difference is, I think, if you know like, oh, I need to publish some things to get a minimum to stay in my job, or I need this minimum, then you can trade off. You're able to say like, look, I care about informing people, and I also need to do something popular enough to like make my subscribers. But the purpose beyond that, beyond the metric, is to inform people. The worrying thing for me about value capture is what happens when there's this transition where once you start taking that on
internal,
for the people listening, we're both pointing to our hearts. Like when that becomes the focal point of your cares, you lose the stance from which you can trade, when you can be like, I don't want to go all the way. Like those incentives are pretty good, but I don't want that. Like you lose that ability. And it's really, one of the things I found really interesting is talking to people about the story. They often told the same story. At first, you experience this as external pressure, and it's kind of like exhausting and constraining. And at some point, there's a transition to thinking of your life primarily in those terms.
Your own personal value as a human being. I mean, like, genuinely, like, I would feel truly distraught and bad about myself.
Yeah. And I mean, the thing that so many people, this is what I feel that you're saying, is when that happens, something deep inside you dies.
Yeah.
And that's what I want to understand. That was the goal for this, understanding why that.
And that point of nuance is really important too, because, you know, one of the things you could say, right, is if you're designing any organization, an institution or bureaucracy, like to go back to your original example in your philosophy department about like outcomes, like it is actually pretty important to have some outcomes that are measurable. And particularly at a public university, we've seen this with like a bunch of like for-profit colleges where we had to start measuring whether people were actually getting jobs and because it turns out they were just like scamming a lot of people. So, and in the case of my bosses, it really matters that what the ratings are. It's not like some crazy weird thing. Like it does matter to them, and it should matter to them based on their institutional and organizational role. It's being able to keep that out of your heart and put it in its place that is such a struggle.
Yeah. I mean, this is, I think, this is the place that I ended up in with this book that I think is more, there's an early version of me, which is not the version that wrote this book, that's like, metrics are terrible. Large scale data sucks. Yay, humanity, bad numbers.
Right, yes.
And I think what I evolved past that towards is to this view that says something like, look, data and metrics are incredibly valuable, but there's this incredibly important trade-off where they're valuable because they can span vast scales and communicate quickly and be objective in a very specific sense. I want to talk about that. I suspect you're going to find this interesting. There's a very narrow sense in which they're objective, and that's really valuable a lot of the times. But to achieve that, they have to systematically sacrifice a kind of high context sensitivity. And so I think what we're faced with typically is it's not easy. Like if I could come up and say like, just ban all metrics, that would be an easier solution. And I think the thing that I figured out
you can't do that.
Tortures me, is no, you need them. And also the thing that makes them powerful is the thing that makes them highly lossy. The thing that makes them powerful is exactly the usefulness and the inhumanity are inseparable, and that sucks, and we have to live there. That is, I think.
Totally. And that is counterposed in the book. So that's like half of the book is wrestling with that, and half of the book is wrestling with this other set of questions about rules, restrictions, goals, and incentives, which is how they develop in a game playing context. And the book is an attempt to kind of work through the relationship between these two. So on the sort of game question, let's do the thing that you do in a philosophy class that I always loved, which is, philosophy is the exercise of definitions, right? So there's there's words that we use. We say, I love you. Your kid says, I love you back. I'm in love with this person. They're in love with so-and-so. And then you go into a philosophy class your freshman year, you're like, well, what exactly, what's love? And then you start to push it and you're like, well, wait a second. this is actually really doesn't quite got it. It's actually way more complicated. Like, so let's just start there with a game. Like, what's a game? How should I think about a game?
Amazing. This is, so the turning point of my entire intellectual life was a moment when one of my advisors, the wonderful Calvin Normer, handed me a book. And that book is Bernard Suits' The Grasshopper. It is a lost cult classic from a Canadian philosopher, Bernard Suits, who tried to define a game. It's also a complex philosophical joke. So it stages a morality tale. The story of the grasshopper and the ant. The ant works and is the hero, and the grasshopper is idle and dies. This is a defense of the grasshopper, and it's staged as a pseudo-Socratic dialogue. It starts with the grasshopper dying, surrounded by his disciples. And his disciples are saying, let us feed you. And the grasshopper says, no, I would rather die for my commitment to idleness than turn you into ants in my name. And he does two things. He gives a definition of games, and then he argues that games are the meaning of life. It's like wild. And at first, I thought the first part was cool, and the second part was dumb, and now I'm totally convinced. So I'll try to convince you. But here's his definition of a game. He says to play a game is to voluntarily take on unnecessary obstacles to make possible the experience of struggling to overcome them. Right. Another way to put that
That's so
is
good.
it's so delicious. By the way, this means video games, computer games, sports, fly fishing, like a lot of
Rock
not
climbing.
everyone. Rock climbing, definitely. I think some gardening. I'll try to make that case. But one way he puts it is that in a game, the goal is constraint constituted. So in practical life, you're trying to achieve some outcome, and what's valuable is the outcome, kind of independent of how you got there. And so you just try to get there as efficiently as possible. In a game, what you're trying to do is partially constituted by the constraints you took. What this means is if you're trying to run a marathon, you're trying to get to the finish line. But the finish line is not a point in space. It's getting to that space along a particular way following particular constraints. If you take a taxi, you did not cross the finish line.
Yes.
If you take a step ladder to the basketball court and climb it and pass the ball through the net, you did not make a basket, right? So the goal is essentially entangled with the method that we use to get there. And this, I think, is crucial because what this makes Suits say is that the reason we do it can't just be the outcome on itself. It has to be the particular process, right? If you just wanted to be at the finish line, you would take an Uber or rent a bird. The fact that we put that off means that what we care about is a particular kind of struggle. What it means is that what's valuable is a particular process or achievement under a particular methodology. And I think this is I now have a diagnosis. I think basically in the post-factory world, it's hard for us to remember that things are valuable that are not just discrete outcomes, like discrete little portable things that you can give to someone else. That's where we think the seat of value is. And Suits was an Aristotle scholar. He thought this was just his version of Aristotle. And what Aristotle said was that the meaning of life is in rich, interesting activity, right? It's in the doing. There's an argument at the end of The Grasshopper, which I find amazing, where he says, imagine utopia where we solved all our practical problems. What would we do? We would play games, or we would be bored out of our minds.
Yes,
so if
exactly.
games are what we do in utopia, they must be the meaning of life. And when I saw this argument, at first I was like, this is dumb. You're smiling. Tell me your reaction.
It seems clever but false, but very clever. But I have to sit with it.
Yeah, I mean, let me tell you the non-gamey version. This is just an argument. This is a version of Aristotle's argument that what is the point of stuff, of making stuff? Like, is it just to have stuff? No, it's the stuff is there in order to permit interesting human activity, right? This is the last shred of this in our life, I think, is the motivational poster that says the journey is the destination. That's this idea.
Yes.
And I think one way to put it for me is that games make it obvious. They force you to see that it would be dumb for me to climb a rock the rock climbing way if what I wanted to be was at the top of the rock, because there's an easy way up the back. In almost every rock climb, there's a stroll path up the back. It is idiotic. The only justification for that act is that I want the particular experience of moving delicately, using my body, balancing, problem solving. I want to use my capacities, right? I want to exercise them and be caught in the intensity of finding a particular balance point or figuring out a way to move my hips to get up the rock. And I think this is one of the interesting things for me about games, and you mentioned this at the beginning, is the way we plunge in. And the best version of scoring systems is this. The intensity of trying, the experience I cherish of becoming this hyper elegant being in rock climbing is only possible if I make myself really want to get to the top of the rock. Mm-hmm. Without that, that's the fuel that creates this whole experience. If that isn't there, then that experience has no savor.
And what's so funny about this paradox is that investment, even though the goal isn't the point, the investment and artifice of it has to be strong enough for all the other things to flower. So here's a great example of this, and maybe you get to this later in the book that I'm reading, which is the problem. As I was reading the book, I was like, we have to get you to Adam Silver, the NBA, to fix the All-Star game. Because the All-Star game in the NBA is suffering from this problem, which is that it's an exhibition game that doesn't mean anything. And so no one tries that hard and no one plays real basketball. But because they don't play real basketball, it's unwatchable.
Yeah.
Because what you need, and they haven't cracked the code of how to give enough of the goal direction that people will actually dig in and play defense and hustle back and do all the things that make the game worthwhile. And it's such a profound truth that it only works if everyone sort of subscribes. Otherwise, the whole thing falls apart.
Yeah. So there's a central distinction in the stuff I've done on games that I think I learned from Suits, but he didn't use this language. I think when you're playing a game, there's a difference between what I'm calling achievement play and striving play. So achievement play is playing because you want to win. You care about winning, right? Striving play is making yourself care about winning temporarily in order to have the joy of the struggle. And so here's my proudest achievement as a philosopher is the following argument. So some people doubt that striving play exists. Here's my argument that striving play exists. Consider the category of stupid games. A stupid game is a game where the fun part is failing, but it's only fun if you're actually trying to win. Like Twister. Yes. So if you fall on purpose, it's not funny because what's funny is failure. Twister's only funny if you're really trying not to fall. Yes. You have to have that investment, right? That's the weird and fascinating thing about games, which is I'm getting the sense that you like the geeky parts of this. There's a concept, again, this is from Aristotle, of a self-effacing end. This is one of my favorite weird parts of philosophy. So a self-effacing end is an end that you can't achieve directly. You can't go at it. So if you want to relax, here's how to fail. Try to relax. Just sit there. Exactly. Try really hard to relax. Relaxation is a self-effacing end. The way you get there is the way I get there is I try to climb a rock. That's the weird thing. My purpose for rock climbing is to clear my head and experience beauty and relax. But the only way I can do those is not to chase those directly, but to make myself just deeply want to get to the top of the rock. And one way to put it is, and let me see if this makes sense to you. Maybe this is too cute. In normal practical life and in striving play, we take the ends for the sake of the means. But the ends don't actually matter. Being at the top of the cliff doesn't matter. You get there, you lower off.
Yes.
I fly fish. I catch the fish, and then I let it go.
You have a great example of your fly fishing mentor who doesn't even put the hook on. Because even the catch and release part seems too much, because the satisfaction is just getting the fish to actually come up to the lure. You don't even have to go through the hooking it.
Yeah. This is Nicole, one of the sages of fly fishing that taught me. And sometimes when the fish are spawning, she cuts the hook off of her fly, because one message I've taken from fishing is that if your goal is to just catch the most fish you can, then you're often going to be driven to really boring methods.
Right.
And if you can release yourself from that a little bit and realize that there are some methods that are arcane and weird and don't catch you that many fish, but they're goddamn beautiful. The cast is beautiful. The movement is beautiful. So I engage in a very inefficient method of fishing. My favorite kind of fishing is dry fly fishing, which involves having to cast a tiny floating imitation insect that I've tied myself to get a fish that I see to swim up to the surface and eat that fly. And it is a dumb way to fish. It is a very inefficient way to fish. It is far less efficient than bait. It is if you really wanted to catch fish, here's the interesting thing. You would use a net, right? The thing that we're doing, that fishers are doing, of trying to trick a fish, is a weird, arcane act that we do because those constraints force you to a weird particular form of consciousness. If your goal is to catch a fish that you can see with an imitation insect, then you have to pay so much attention to the surface of the water, the movement of water, the patterns of the water, what insect life is like. And I mean,
and
that
that's
attention
the joy.
is the point. Yeah.
That's the thrill. And
that is the thrill.
This division between striving play and achievement play really, really spoke to me in my own experience. And I think it's a little bit of a kind of maturation progression. So my own experience to basketball, which I was extremely ego invested in as a young man. And I was very competitive, and I would say achievement play, although the thing I was trying to do was win and also feel like I'm good.
Yeah.
Which is like score points or show off and through the course of my basketball life, now I'm 46 years old and I play pickup still and not particularly well. And I was never particularly good, actually, is the irony. It's all striving play, and it's such a more enjoyable experience too. Like so much of my ego is on the line. I just want to get into the enjoyable flow state of playing basketball. But in order for that to happen, like I care, like I go for loose balls and I like try to stop the person from scoring because I understand that that's part of it. But that shift has happened to me. And I wonder if you think that this shift is part of like the trajectory from one to the other, like actual aging, maturation, different times in our life were in different contexts where we feel one or the other, personality driven, like how to move between those two modes.
I think what you're talking about is a cultivation of one of the most important parts of the human spirit. The philosopher Maria Lugones, who is incredible, says that what playfulness is the ability to transition between different worlds of different rule sets. And what you're talking about, I mean, what I think the striving play experience is you plunge into a rule set and then you step back from it and you ask yourself what you actually cared about. And then you steer yourself towards what you cared about. So I think I remember one time I was on the river fly fishing and I met this guy and he was using a methodology that's very efficient. It's called Euronyming, doesn't matter, super geeky. And it's, some people really like it, some people really don't. And this guy was like, I hate fishing this way, but you got to do it because you catch more fish. And you have this thought that's like, it's like, what are we doing here? We're letting the fish go. Like what?
To what end?
What? And I think one way to put it is, we've been hovering around these words, but like part of the background is that in a game, the goal and the purpose are very different, right? The goal for me in rock climbing is to go up. The purpose is to have meditation. But we can forget in games and out of games what the larger purpose is and get trapped in the goal. We can forget to step back and ask, is this giving me the experience I want? Or is this metric tracking the thing that's actually valuable? Or is this game giving me a rich and full bodily and emotional experience? Or is it just miserable? And if we forget that, if we just get swamped by the point scoring system without having the larger reflective stance, right? I mean, one way to put it is what the thing that you're talking about, the maturity that you're talking about, is the ability to step back from rule sets and assess whether the rule sets actually are helping guide your action towards something good, as opposed to just accepting the rule sets as a given, which is weird because in games there's so many alternate rule sets. We should be able to be like, screw this one.
There's also the complexity of, and this gets into some of the literature on flow, which you know there's obviously best-selling book about and a huge literature on, but there's also this really tricky thing about finding that sweet spot of not too hard, not too easy, right? And the fact that that constantly changes. I mean, I've been the place where I've sort of seen the kind of humor in this a little bit is skiing, because I'm not a very good skier at all, and I didn't grow up skiing. And as an adult, I do it kind of once in a while, and sort of we take the kids once a year so they could kind of know how to ski. But there's a very funny thing that happens, which is you want to be just at sort of the frontier of your ability, or it's boring. But then as you get better and better, then you have to find like bigger and bigger mountains and then and then things. Whereas if you just stay where I am, like a pleasantly enjoyable green skier, I can go to basically any dinky mountain and have a good time because I'm not that good. But there is a little bit of a hedonic treadmill with all this stuff, right? Where the better you get, the more that you need to get you to fulfill that sense of striving at your limit.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one way that I've often thought of it is that most of the time the world forces particular goals and obstacles on us, and we don't get to manipulate them, so we just have to do a lot of crap. And games are this weird space where sometimes, not always, but sometimes we get to manipulate the goal and the constraints to hit the sweet spot we want. But also, and I think this is super important, that sweet spot varies from person to person. Like, I like gruelingly hard games. I like miserably hard. I'm currently doing something. My current obsession is something called Kendama, which is this Japanese ball and cup game. Go look up.
It's this one that where you.
Yeah, with the spike. And it's collided with skateboard culture. Go look up some videos of what modern Kendama has become. Okay. It is gonzo. People are doing absurdly difficult tricks. And the tricks are ones where like it requires so much focus and so much intensity that I will like just sit there for an hour just trying to pull off one move that involves like tossing things, multiple flips, snatching things out of the air. And I love that, but not everyone does, and that's okay. And some days that's not what I want. But there's also trick scaling. So one of the interesting things about things like kendama and skateboarding is if you're feeling chill, you can just do easy tricks. That's the game you can play that day. And if you just crave like this brute force from something else just to like hammer on you, then you can push yourself against the hardest thing right against your limit. But games, unlike practical life, give us the freedom to manipulate the goals and constraints to get the sweet spot that we want. They make us free with respect to the action that we're trying to do.
And a lot of the alienation of sort of modern life, whether that's online or it's in your workplace or you're trying to get grades, you're trying to get into the good grad school, is the feeling of someone else's scorekeeping and that you're performing. And there's a letter that you get from someone who watched a lecture of yours that I found was incredibly moving. It ends the first chapter of the book. And I wonder if you could just like recount that, because it kind of unlocks in some ways a sort of conceptual insight for the whole project.
Yeah. I mean, so I was starting to write about this stuff and I didn't even know if I wanted to write a book here or if it should just be about games or if it should just be about metrics. And I was giving some talks and I got this email from an undergraduate that had heard one of my online talks. And she said that it had pulled her out of a 5-year depressive cycle because it turns out, was a lot like me. First generation Asian American immigrant, pushed to get straight A's. She was a varsity athlete. Unlike me, I was not a varsity athlete. She's also, she says, anorexic. And each of these, she said, she came to realize was a game she was playing. It was a terrible game, but she hadn't even realized that she had choice, right? She didn't realize she had a dimensionality. She had not realized she was stuck in games that she didn't want to be playing. And so she sent me, she said that she modified the screen of her iPhone to remind her. And she sent me a picture. And what the back of her iPhone says is this the game you really want to be playing? And she said that was like the reminder every time. I also think it's super complicated because when some of the external games are ones that we have some degree of choice over, right? I think like my also obsession with weight loss is something that I could move in and out. But other ones, it's really hard, right? Like when you're in large-scale institutional systems, there are these pervasive systems that speak at us and they compel us to attend to them. And it's not like we can escape from the system, but maybe at a minimum, we can like refuse to let it creep inside of ourselves and like redefine our values.
Yeah. How do you think about that part of it? Where we find our agency when someone else has arranged the rules of the game and what the scoring metric is. And Right. In some cases, we have some control over that can, obviously, I don't want to overstate this. People have very deep struggles with, say, anorexia or things, but there's some degree to which we can move in and out, as you said, of those. But other things like your boss is like, this is what your
Right.
job will depend on. You have to hit this metric. You have to hit this quota. That you don't really get to say yes or no unless you lose the job.
I mean, there's one thing I can say is some of this is just institutional and structural. And one thing, a lot of this depends on the degree to which people in power decide to emphasize or like you can make GPA the center of an educational system, or you can de-emphasize it to some degree. But I think to really understand how hard it is to resist letting this inside you, you really have to understand like why it's so compelling. And I think for that, you need to understand why they're so powerful, right? And I was lost on this for a while. I was reading a bunch of stuff, and it was unclear to me why. I had a simple theory, which was like, look, games are nice because the world is complicated and games make things simple. So maybe we just like things simple. So we're just like seduced by the simplicity of these external scoring systems. Like things are easy if all I care about is money or ranking. But I think it's even deeper than that. And I found this answer. There are these two incredible scholars, Theodore Porter and Lorraine Daston. They're intellectual historians. And they gave me this nugget that I'm going to try to distill from their work that explains, I think, a lot of the power of metrics. So the way that Porter puts it is this. He says, qualitative information, like saying things in words, not in metrics, that kind of knowledge is dynamic, rich, open-ended, but it doesn't travel well because it requires high shared background information to understand, and it does not aggregate. So I think about this of like, when I write evaluations for my students, I work on multiple dimensions. I don't have to collapse it in one dimension. I can talk about creativity versus rigor. I can use all the weird internal language of philosophy to connect on. But that is A, incomprehensible to the business dean and HR for a Silicon Valley company. And B, it won't aggregate. And it won't aggregate precisely because different people are responding on multiple different dimensions. What travels well is grade point average. And what grade point average is, this is how Porter puts it. He says, an institutional metric, a quantification in a bureaucracy, works by identifying a context-invariant kernel whose meaning is simple enough that it can be understood across contexts without high shared background knowledge. One way he puts it is that institutional data has been engineered to travel. It's portable. It's been made to be portable. And so it can cross context easily. And once you fix that meaning, once everyone agrees what an A is and a B is and a C is, then you can aggregate it instantly in a spreadsheet. And here's the thing the way he puts it, that struck terror into my heart and still is like, to me, like one of the most horrifying insights. What he's saying is the power of metrics and the price of metrics are inextricable. They speak clearly across contexts and unify people across context and are highly comprehensible and highly aggregatable precisely because they've been engineered to remove nuance and context. Another way, Lorraine Daston, I could rant forever about this, but the way Lorraine Daston puts it is that in many cases, institutional data is collected with mechanical rules, and mechanical rules are things that are designed so anybody could follow them. So you don't need to exercise sensitivity or experience or judgment, but instead you can swap out any worker. You can change out the worker. And if you have a clear enough rule set, you don't need to depend on their particular sensitivity. They will execute and count in the same way. So the image here is exactly, I mean, here's one way to put it. Here's the real seduction of value capture. If you let yourself be value captured by a metric, you are no longer mysterious. Okay, let me tell you about one of the most embarrassing things. So when I was writing the book, I got obsessed with learning to yo-yo. I was looking for scenes in which an aesthetic scene had been transformed by a competition. I heard about yo-yo. I started yo-yoing. I love yo-yoing. It's super interesting. It's highly like delicate, complex movement, super wild. To be an adult professional philosopher at a dinner party and tell people that you've been yo-yoing is one of the most embarrassing possible things. Because the joys of it are so obscure and so in-world. And what I find myself doing, to my shame, is saying, oh, yo-yoing is great. It de-stresses me so I can write more each day.
Right.
That's false, but it's legible. Right. Writing more each day is a legible metric that transfers, right, across people. It's highly comprehensible because it tags to a kind of value that everyone can see. So metrics offer us this trade-off of greater comprehensibility, greater legibility, greater accessibility of our justifications. And the cost is any intimate, sensitive, high context, personal, or small-scale communal sense of value.
There's a sense in which like this problem is as old as it's as old as civilization. I mean, right? Like we go back to Ur, and they're like the first thing bureaucracies do is count, right? And then so that's as old as civilization. You know, the kind of modern version of the dawn of industrial capitalism and the managerial revolution, and trying to sort of, you know, quantify things that come out of factories and be able to sort of have numbers to outputs. And then I think in the level we're at with the dawn of the smartphone, where like that form of quantification, that metric-driven reality now extends out past, very far out past what was, say, the factory floor or the office to every second of our day, because it's measured with this device that's become sort of bound to us. Do you think that's a continuity, or is there something radically disjunctive? This is a thing that I wrestled with in my book. And it's a thing, I think there was a New Yorker article by a historian that was sort of critical of it as being a little, you know, the camp that I'm in on all this stuff, which is that there's something new about this tech and our relationship to it that's doing something new to us, which draws on older things. And the camp that says it's a sort of, there's real continuity there, and it's ahistorical to see that as a disjuncture. What do you think?
This is the most delicious possible question. Okay, so let me tell you what I used to think, and then the weird position. So what I used to think was, this is new. This is a gamification. We've adopted these new technologies people have made to like capture people's attention and addict people to like that came out of video poker. And this is totally new. And I also started thinking, there's a chunk of philosophy, there's a world of philosophy about something called extended mind, and the idea is something like we make our technologies part of ourselves, right? Like one of the arguments is something like my phone, the calendar on my phone is a part of my memory.
Yes,
like, right. When it tells me to do something, I do it. Like I trust it more than my memory. It's part of my functional memory. It's part of me as much as my meat brain is. And an old theory I had was, one way I started putting it to myself is that value capture is outsourcing your values to a technology. When you're value captured by likes on Facebook, you're outsourcing your values to Mark Zuckerberg. You're letting the determinant of of a particular technology shape your values. And what I've come to think is that there is a profound continuity in the movement of the world towards being ruled by metrics. There is at least 1,000 longer history of creating large-scale transmissible information. And one of my favorite examples, you're letting me have my geek flag fly. One of my favorite examples of this is of land measures. So I learned this from, this is in Theodore Porter and James Scott. It used to be that we measured land in much more functional units. So in England, the functional unit was called the hide. And the hide is the amount of land required to feed and support an average family. Notice that's not a fixed amount of volume, right? Hide near a river is small, right? And it's also not an average yield. Like if production, if it crashes out once every 5 years, that's not a hide, right? So it's a highly functional measure that requires incredibly high local knowledge to deploy. And so when we see a movement from localized administration to centralized administration, we stop using the hide because you can't train any surveyor to use it, and you start using acres and kilometers. The hide seems to vanish around like 11 or 1200. So this is like the transition point is we're at this long movement towards the kind of ways of evaluating the world that can be more easily shared between distant people. That's really long. The other thing I think that is distinctive, and I don't know if this is like a sharp line or not, is I think what really matters, what's really changing is the scale of integration. So scales become really important here for me. This is one thing I've come to think is that people in my profession, philosophers, don't think a lot about scale, and other people do. And if you notice, like when I was talking about quantification, what I said was what really matters is the ability to cross contexts. The number of different contexts represents a constraint on how deep the information is. So I can create a quantification among the people in my philosophy department, and it can be pretty complex and sensitive if we have a lot of time to talk. The more distant and the more different contexts it has to cross, the thinner it needs to be. And I think there's going to be a big difference between a metric that is designed to work in one factory with one bunch of people that make shoes, and a metric that's designed across industries, designed across nations. And the thing that I'm thinking is that this process has been starting, but for various technological reasons, it's easier and easier to integrate information at scale. Right?
Right.
And so
thinner and thinner and thinner gets the metric
exactly the thinner
as a logical entailment. I mean,
yes,
definitionally.
Exactly. Definitionally, if you think that there's a trade-off between how easily something can travel between contexts and how informationally thin it needs to be, then we should expect that the most universal and most socially powerful metrics are the most deadly thin.
Which I think does stick to like this, to me, the central question that I was wrestling with in the Sirens Call, and I think that you're wrestling with this in the book, is like, what it feels like to be alive like right now and why it feels that way. and that's, I think, a central human question through all times. And we can't, because we don't ever have the subjective experience of being alive in any time but the one that we're in, we're going to be disposed, I think, to ahistoricize and things like that. And part of what scholarship is to like keep wrenching us back to these enduring questions. But on a place to end, to me, is like, there's a lot of, I don't want to get too self-helpy, but part of what I think is really interesting about the book is like, you have worked through different ways that you deal with this in fly fishing and rock climbing and other things, about people that are listening to this and thinking about ways to operationalize it in their lives. Because I think there really are things that drop out here that you talk about finding things that for you get you into the space of striving play, which there are things in my life that I have found that are great sources of joy.
There's a few ways to approach that question, and that's a delicious and massive question. One way is just realizing that there's dimensions of choice. I mean, sometimes we don't have choice. Sometimes it's like,
you got to sell this many shoes.
Or we're going to fire you. But there's dimensions of choice about what we commit to in our hearts. And I think we can forget that we have dimensions of choice. Like, one of the things I learned from a lot of these historians is this idea that once we decide a way of doing things and it enters the background informational infrastructure, it just starts looking natural. And we forget that there was another way of doing things. A moment that I really, when I was researching this book, I had a moment where I retroactively became incredibly ashamed of my past self. And Lorraine Daston, this historian I love, talks about how one of the places you can spot this kind of hyper-mechanicity is in cookbooks, that we're used to a kind of new school recipe, right? That like 2 cups of this, 3 cups of that in 45 minutes. But if you look at old school recipes, a lot of them are like, knead the bread until it feels like bubbly and alive, and then bake it until it sounds nice when knocked. And when you look at something like that, you might think to yourself, oh, that's primitive, right? That's medieval. That's gross. It it's actually a really good instruction set if you know what you're doing. Because, knocking on something to hear its bubbles is really good, but it doesn't look real. And what it reminded me of was a moment I had when I went to my mother after I went home from college, came home from college, and I asked her, she's an incredible cook, how to cook my favorite Vietnamese dish, which is Vietnamese hot and sour catfish soup. And she gave me this like weird, oozing, complicated, like, oh, you have to taste it, you have to decide this. And what I said was, what is this third world bullshit, Mom? Give me something real. And what I realized, to my shame, is that I had been so mentally colonized by bureaucracy that I thought what was real, what was written accessibly and simplified in standard measures in a cookbook, and what I thought wasn't real was the way that actually great cooks cook, which is tasting and feeling and deciding for themselves and adapting and adjusting. And I think I have this sense that what we've come to think is that the same thing has happened with value. Does that make sense? That we think real value is the stuff that can be measured in a standard way. And that's like the intrusion of a bureaucratic sensibility into us. And I think one of the first things to try to do is get that out.
I've been hosting a television show now for 15 years and for a primetime show for 13. And I think I now approach my work like a cook in that way, where something sounds right or it sounds wrong, or it feels right or it feels wrong, or it's really tactile, whether it's working or not. And it's not a recipe. And I think my constant struggle is you're constantly operating inside an institution that, for its institutional reasons, is going to have recipes and going to have metrics. And so that's the sort of daily struggles. Like, you have developed some sense of the craft. You're kind of trying to cook with the knocking on the bread and the kneading and the feeling. And I think this is probably true in teaching, and it's true in philosophy, and it's true in a million different ways. And institutionally, organizationally, that qualitative, intangible, difficult to describe, highly context-dependent stuff doesn't travel well. And so you have to kind of find the space in your work life or in what part of your life to make space for that amidst what is going to almost naturally be a set of pressures for metrics that thin that out.
And a lot of those pressures are good. I think this is the really painful part. It is, I think, for you and I, when we talk about this stuff, it's like, oh, go by feel, go by texture. That's also what people say when they're justifying racism or sexism or bias, right? I mean, this is what
Slash also is not helpful if you're just learning to cook. I mean, that's the other thing, right? This sense of feel at 13 years in, I feel like I could do it, but it was not helpful. I mean, I needed a recipe. Right. You need a recipe when you're first starting.
You need recipes when you're starting. You need clear metrics, because people are often corrupt or biased and incompetent, and they're trying to hide it.
Yeah.
And the painful thing is that we not only can't get rid of metrics, we don't want to, because they're incredibly functionally powerful. Right. So what we need to do is learn to live with them while remembering. I mean, I guess one way to put it is
the double reality of them, I think.
Yeah. Like you're up against them, and I think it's too easy to think they're bad, inchoate, dumb things that just force us around. You have to see that what they are cross-cutting communication tools that are thin, and live with them that way, which often means simultaneously understanding their immense coordinative informational value while living with the fact that they cannot capture everything that's important, and yet knowing that they're the currency of communication. And that is hard.
C.T. Wynn is a philosophy professor at the University of Utah. He's the author of the new book, The Score: How to Stop Playing Somebody Else's Game, a book that I really, really urge you to read. I think you will find so much in it to keep you thinking for a long time. Thank you so much. That was great.
Thank you.